Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Thursday, the 28th, and I am continuing on from where we left off last class, which was our first class. I hope you had an opportunity to watch it, where basically I gave a introduction to the class itself, and I posted a syllabus and a course outline so that you could have a sense of what it is that we'll be doing over the course of the semester. And as I indicated, I like to start slowly. I'm well aware that people are adding and dropping and still trying to find textbooks and so forth and so on. So basically, today's class is, I still consider introduction, but introduction in terms of the specific academic subject we're going to be studying, and that happens to be literature. And what sounds like a simple question, what is literature? We'll find out is a pretty complex question that we will be grappling with over the course of the semester. And I had assigned some readings from our textbook. And if you still don't have the textbook, worry not, because I'm going to be talking about those readings and then you can read them after the fact. The good news is that once we actually start talking about the pieces of literature, and we're beginning with short story, I've got links for those in the event that you don't have the textbook. Though the textbook would be ideal, because obviously you can annotate or write in the textbook, and also the textbook gives some supplemental information that is not available online. And what I had scheduled for today was reading imaginative literature, critical strategies for reading, and reading fiction. But before I begin any of those, there was one piece of the syllabus that I did not discuss, and it's about plagiarism, which is basically using somebody else's language or ideas without acknowledging the source. It's a pretty serious academic offense. If you get off easy, you could fail that assignment. If you don't get off easy, you could end up being expelled from the college with a notation indicating that you plagiarized. And I always tell two stories to my classes about plagiarism to try to encourage individuals not to be tempted to plagiarize. The first occurred to me in the early days of my teaching career. So this was pre-internet, so I couldn't rely on any sources to do any kind of research. And as many internet sources that exist to help students plagiarize, there are an equal number of sources to help professors determine whether or not someone is plagiarizing. One of my favorites is called turnitin.com, where basically you can type in a sentence or a paragraph and do an electronic search. But at any rate, I didn't have any of that, but I knew I was reading a paper that sounded familiar, which is not that unusual since professors tend to be pretty well read. And it didn't take me long, I must say, to figure out where I'd seen this before, because it was actually a passage from the college textbook that I had assigned for our course. And I don't know if this person thought that I wouldn't recognize it, which obviously I did. And there were a few mechanical errors in there, whether because they were sloppy in terms of their copying, or they hoped perhaps that if there were a few errors I wouldn't notice, I'm not sure. But nevertheless, that's my personal story. The better story did not occur to me, but it occurred around the same time period, pre internet, to a middle aged professor. And that part is important, a middle aged professor. And basically, he was reading a series of papers and realized that one of those papers sounded familiar. And he too could not do an electronic search. And as he began to mull it over, where have I read this before? Where have I read this before? It occurred to him he hadn't read it, he wrote it decades earlier when he had been an undergraduate student in college himself. It was one of his old papers. And it had something to do with the fraternity that he had belonged to that was basically collecting and recycling old papers from fraternity members. And somehow, some way, it got into the hands of one of his current students. And not only did this student get into trouble for plagiarizing, but this student became part of a media spectacle as all of the academic newspapers, and yes, there are such things as academic newspapers, publish this story. So I always tell these two pieces to my class in order to encourage you not to plagiarize. And I'm hopeful that the way that the class is structured, it would also be helpful for you to not be tempted to plagiarize, because you have informal writing assignments that are journals, and those are just supposed to be your responses and reactions to the readings, and they're graded informally. And the two formal papers are both critical papers, and you aren't doing outside research. Though, again, if you have your heart set on doing research, let me know. We could talk about some of the options available. But basically, the first critical paper is a paper that you can rewrite after you've gotten feedback from me. And the second, well, you probably wouldn't be able to rewrite it if you handed it in on the due date, If you handed it in early, there was some possibility of negotiation with me, with revision. So I'm hopeful again that that will encourage you to not be tempted to do something like that, plagiarizing. And when we were reviewing the syllabus, I had forgot to mention critical thinking, which is one of the things that I emphasize in all of my classes. And critical thinking isn't necessarily about thinking negatively, being critical, but it's about asking questions and analyzing and interpreting. And basically, it's what we will be doing with literature throughout the entire semester. Reading more than just for plot, but trying to understand how and why those pieces of plot fit together to give us larger statements and messages. And it's the difference, I would say, between knowing what something is and knowing why something is, which I've oftentimes said is the distinction between high school, which is about learning a lot of whats, and college, trying to grapple with a lot of whys. And interestingly, toddlers work very nicely with the question why. If you've ever worked with a toddler before, spent time with a toddler, you know that that's one of their favorite questions. And that will be one of our primary questions over the course of the semester. Why? When it comes to all of these short stories. But first, we have to try to figure out what is a short story, what is a drama, what is a poem, and more broadly, what is literature. And that gets us to our readings today about reading imaginative literature. And those were on pages 1 through 7 if you're using the edition of the textbook that I had ordered for class. And I wanted to quote from the first page. Quote, literature does not lend itself to a tidy definition, unquote. And I think we will find that over the course of the semester. I mean, certainly you can look up the word literature in a dictionary if you so wanted to. But what qualifies as a piece of literature and what qualifies as a piece of literature worthy of study is up to a good amount of debate. I mean, some suggestions is that a piece of good literature should broaden our perspective. It should entertain. And I know that you will be reading pieces this semester that you might think this isn't terribly entertaining, at least for you, but it might be entertaining to someone else. And we also need to think about the time period in which the piece was written, because it might have been entertaining in that time period, in that society, and not necessarily be as entertaining in our contemporary time period. Something that provides social commentary. Usually there's a reason why authors go through the blood, the sweat, and the tears of trying to create a piece of literature. They want to do more than just entertain. They want to give some sort of a message. More often than not, they're trying to persuade the reader of their particular perspective. But the way they do it is very clever. Rather than coming out outright and saying what they think we should support, instead, they tell us a story. And if you think about that, that's usually one of the first things that kids want. They want a story. They want to be entertained. But much like kids' stories and fairy tales, embedded within those stories are messages and morals. And we'll see this as well in the literature that we're reading. You don't necessarily have to agree with the author's message, but you do need to be able to identify what the author's message is first before you can decide whether you agree or disagree with that particular message. And also, pieces of literature use language in very interesting ways, unique ways. If you want to think about it, it would be very simple to say something like, I think you're very beautiful. Or you could say, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. They both basically are saying the same thing, but obviously the Shakespearean version, which was the second version, uses language in a much more complex way than the first version. Now, if we were meeting in class, at this point, I would distribute a handout to you about an essay that appeared in the New York Times. Luckily, I was able to find a link for this particular essay, and if you look below this video, you'll see that I'm posting the class notes, which are basically the summaries of what I was talking about in the video, or what I might write on a whiteboard, let's say, if we were meeting in person. So I'm going to ask you to look at that link and to read that link about your brain on fiction that appeared in the New York Times. And I just wanted to highlight a few of the pieces of that particular essay, where it says that, and this came out in 2012, brain scans were used to reveal what happens in our minds when we read basically a detailed description or an evocative metaphor or an emotional exchange between characters. In other words, stories stimulate the brain and can even change the way we act in life. according to this research. So there are classical language regions, for instance, that are involved in how brains interpret words. And what scientists realize in studying these is that narratives activate many other parts of the brain as well, suggesting why the experience of reading can feel so alive. I don't know if any of you have ever had the experience of reading something and actually forgetting that you're reading, that you're so immersed in the story, but it's a wonderful sensation. So basically what this means is that words like lavender and cinnamon and soap would elicit a response not only from the language processing areas of brains, but also those areas of the brain that are devoted to scent. So a 2006 study in Spain actually asked participants to read words with strong odor associations and then neutral words while their brains were being scanned by MRI machines. So when they read words like perfume and coffee, the area of their brain associated with scent lit up. When they saw words like chair and key, that area did not light up. And it was very similar with using metaphors or comparing two dissimilar things. Some scientists thought that figures of speech, like a rough day, were so familiar to us that they would be treated simply as words and no more. However, a team of researchers at Emory University found that when subjects read a metaphor involving texture, the sensory cortex of the brain, and that's the area that's responsible for perceiving texture through touch, became active. So something like the singer had a velvet voice or he had leathery hands roused the sensory cortex, while phrases like the singer had a pleasing voice and he had strong hands didn't. And this was also found in terms of motion. And these studies were done in different time periods in different cultures. This happens to be a study that was done in France, where the brains of participants were scanned as they read sentences like John grasped the object and Pablo kicked the ball. And the scans revealed activity in the motor cortex, which coordinates the body's movements. And also, the activity was concentrated in the part of the motor cortex where the movement described was arm-related, and another part of the motor cortex where the movement concerned the leg. So what does all of this mean? The brain, it seems, does not seem to make much of a distinction between reading about an experience and encountering it in real life. And that means that reading provides a pretty vivid simulation of reality, almost like a computer simulation would run on computers. Fiction, with its details and its metaphors and its descriptions, offers an especially rich replica. And basically, in one respect, novels go beyond simulating reality to give readers an experience that is not available in the real world. The opportunity to enter fully into another person's thoughts or feelings. And of course, we can try to judge other people's thoughts and feelings, but in the end, we can never know exactly what it is they're thinking or feeling. We have to rely on what they tell us and how they act in order for us to make those particular judgments. So in Canada, yet another study was done, and they saw that there is substantial overlap in the brain networks used to understand stories and the networks used to navigate interactions with other individuals. In particular, interactions in where we're trying to figure out the thoughts and feelings of others. And narratives then offer a unique opportunity to engage this capacity as we identify with characters' longings and frustrations, guess at their hidden motives, and track their encounters with friends and enemies, neighbors and lovers. So reading hones our real-life social skills as well. And what's more is that additional studies found that readers tend to be more empathetic than non-readers. And this study was done in 2010 and found that just because somebody is more empathetic, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're drawn to reading in and of itself. That they made sure that that was not the case when they were making their studies. So basically, reading is a particularly useful simulation because negotiating the social world effectively is extremely tricky, and I'm quoting here, requiring us to weigh up interacting instances of cause and effect. And just as computer simulations can help us get to grips with complex problems, such as flying a plane or forecasting the weather, so novels, stories, dramas can help us understand the complexities of social life. So, to answer the question of why are we studying literature, and yes, it is a requirement, and it oftentimes is a requirement in colleges because you want to have a broad education, you want to have some understandings of the great literary tradition, and also it helps you to improve your reading and your writing skills when you're reading literature. But even on a grander level, what literature can do is to help us negotiate our social worlds. We can never necessarily experience everything that we read about. However, this is as close as we can get without actually experiencing it. And this is particularly useful when we're reading pieces from the past. None of us can go back into the past and live that life and truly understand. But the closest we're going to get to understanding that culture and that society is reading stories about that culture and society that were written during that time period. So I hope that that helps you think a little bit differently, perhaps about reading and particularly about literature. And it can be debated as to what's considered to be worthy of study. And in fact, there's a term, a literary term, that's called the canon. And I'm not talking about the canon that you would use in war. I'm talking about the canon being works considered by scholars and critics and teachers to be the most important to read and study. In other words, things that are considered to have a certain level of quality. But that said, there's been debate too about those judgments because bias can be involved, and oftentimes the scholars and the critics and the teachers, especially in the past, were from a very non-representational group. Usually they picked authors who very much were similar to their own ideologies, to their own ethnicities, to their own genders, to their own sexual orientations. And starting around the 60s or so, as students became more diverse, in classrooms, there were questions about this canon and why is it that we tend to read, sometimes it's been called dead white male authors. And where are the females? Where is the ethnic diversity? Where is the contemporary voice, if you will? And that said, you know, there are lots of different ways you could proceed. There are the traditionalists that say you need to know the history, the tradition of literature, and therefore you read those authors that probably have become household names like Hemingway and Faulkner. Or there are those who say that we need to completely update the canon and give newer voices that are just as good or maybe even better an opportunity to be read, but they just were not included in the canon. Or to try to find a combination between the two, which is usually how most classrooms work, and this one as well, is to try to give a little bit of both about some of the traditional authors and also some of the more recent authors as well. A little tidbit, an author that you might have heard of, Herman Melville, who wrote a book that you might have heard of, Moby Dick. And my suspicion is you've heard that it's an excellent book, but you also probably have not read the book, and you may not even know why it's considered an excellent book. You just know that teachers say that. In other words, this book is part of the literary canon. But when it first came out, it was not considered a piece of literature. It was basically viewed as a study of whales, and that's how it was housed in the libraries until it was rediscovered, if you will. And then all of a sudden it became this great literary masterpiece, which goes to show that there can be a political component to literature and what we study and why we study it. And this is true in many academic disciplines as well. History is a very good example, since history is usually told by the victor, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you're getting the most accurate portrayal of a historical event. But for us, as we move beyond trying to establish what is literature worthy of study, we can also talk about how literature became a kind of profession where individuals were devoted to reading and interpreting literature. And this started really in the early 1900s, and these individuals were most often university professors. And universities focus on research as opposed to colleges that focus on teaching, if you're curious to know the difference between the two. So a university professor would do some teaching, but mostly they do research. A college professor would mostly do teaching. However, they could also do some research. And these university professors basically turned the art of reading and interpretation into a kind of profession. And they ended up needing to have a vocabulary developed, just like every other profession has a vocabulary developed. And that leads us to the second set of readings that I had today, critical strategies for reading. And I'm the first to admit that it's pretty dense, and the subject is pretty complex. I took an entire class worth of different ways to go about reading literature in graduate school, and instead we're going to spend about 10 minutes or so talking about this. I just wanted you to get a sense of how basically these individuals who created this profession of reading literature and interpreting it ended up dividing up into specialists, focusing on particular areas. And you can think of it in the way that you might think of law or medicine, where you've got the generalist, but then you've got individuals who branch off into particular specialties. And those specialties are often times labeled by the particular mode in which interpretation is done by that group. So I wanted to begin with first the generalists. They were known as the formalists. And again, this was in the early 1900s, and they studied the formal elements of a work, things like language, structure, and tone, and is probably what all of us have done and do in English classes. So it's the overview of the work as a whole. Starting around the 1940s or the 1960s, a branch broke off, and they call themselves the New Critics, which is an unfortunate label because what was new then is not necessarily new now. So I'm not sure what they were thinking, probably not of the future, because then what do you call yourself, the newer critics or the newest critics? I'm not sure. But at any rate, the New Critics demanded this close reading of the text to talk about things like diction, the use of language, irony, things that can be a contradiction or a paradox, symbolism, representational images in literature, plot, characterization, narration. Lots of language here, and we're going to be talking about some of these terms as the semester progresses. And then there were further breakages which included more specialized disciplines or more specialized ways of reading literature. Biographical critics, as their name would imply, focused on the biography of the author, arguing that if you don't know about the author's life, then you really can't understand their writing. And there is a certain amount of truth to that. For instance, when we get to Ernest Hemingway, we'll talk about that he fought in the war. So when he writes about war, he's talking from some personal experience. So that makes a certain level of sense. But it also is limiting, because just because you're writing about something that you've lived through, that doesn't necessarily mean that that is a representation of what you experienced. And remember, writing is fictional. You can write about something that has absolutely nothing to do with your biography. Psychological critics, as the name would imply, focus on the mental states, whether it be the mental states of the authors who are writing the works, the mental states of the characters within the works, or the mental states of the readers reading the works, or all of the above. Historical critics do just that. They look at history and past events. That in order to truly understand a work, according to them, you need to know the history of the times. That yes, we could read Shakespeare and understand it, but to truly understand Shakespeare, we would have to understand the history of Renaissance society. And again, that makes a certain level of sense. But it also is somewhat limiting, because that means that we really aren't ready to read Shakespeare until we take a history class in the English Renaissance. And that probably isn't a practicality for most of us. Marxist critics, for those of you who study economics and you know about Karl Marx, they talk about socioeconomics. New historicist critics, they focus more on culture and our cultural understanding of the world. And I particularly am interested in cultural and media studies. And there's been a good amount of scholarship about that. If you know anything about Frank Luntz, who is known for being a political pundit, but he also is a consultant to both business and political groups about how to use language to influence behavior. He's very interesting in some of the work that he does. And in fact, whether you know his name or not, you're probably familiar with some of his terms. He's the one who came up with the war on terror, for instance. He's the one that changed the estate tax, which was fairly non-controversial, to the death tax, which just the name change alone led to there being lots of controversy about this tax because nobody wants to be taxed to death. But estate sounds wealthy, so there wasn't as much controversy previously to that tax. But the reason why I mention him is that he argues that if you really want to understand a people, you're not going to look at their history or their politics. What you're going to look at is their media consumption. Things like the books they value, the television shows they watch, the clothes they wear, the food they eat, all of that makes up the behaviors, attitudes, and values of a group of people and their belief system. In other words, their culture. So, cultural critics basically, or new historicist critics, look at the idea of the culture as a whole, not just necessarily the history of a particular culture. History being usually the political and social movements going on during the time. Gender critics study just that, gender. And you can get even more specialized if you are a feminist critic, then you are looking at the idea of the female in a particular text. Mythological critics focus on traditional and legendary cultural stories, which is what a myth is, and how that might be illustrated in a particular text. For instance, the myth of resurrection, which exists as a story in all cultures in one way or another. Reader response critics, this tends to be a favorite of readers and students alike, because the focus is not on the author, the focus is on the reader. In other words, the reader creates meaning. And even though the text doesn't change, the readers change, and therefore the meaning of the text changes. Now, don't misunderstand this and think that what I'm suggesting is that the reader can decide that a particular text means anything the reader wants it to mean just because they feel like it. There has to be some consensus amongst a group of readers, and there has to be some evidence within the text. But basically, there can be changes in the way that individuals respond to a particular text, particularly over time. And deconstructionist critics talk about contradiction. And I can talk a little bit about deconstruction because it was a very popular way of literary criticism back in the 1980s. And it came from a French philosopher, Jacques Derrida, where basically he argued there is no meaning, there is no censor. And this is a very complex theory, but in order to simplify it, basically what he argued is that you can always find contradiction within a text. Almost like trying to add a positive and a negative number, you end up with nothing, with zero. So your job is to try to find as many contradictions as possible. And in fact, we will be reading a short story fairly soon, and I'll let you know when we get to that place, that lends itself very well to the idea of deconstruction. The theory became a lot less interesting as time went on when individuals realized that basically he was arguing that there is meaning in something, and his argument that there is no meaning. Now, his response is this was just yet an illustration of how there is no meaning, but his arguments were so complex that even my own graduate school professor had to admit that he didn't understand them, and he specialized in this. So I suspect that perhaps part of the reason why Jacques Derrida was so popular for at least a period of time is because people had experts in the field had such a difficult time understanding him that they thought that what he was talking about was brilliance, and upon greater reflection, perhaps they've rethought that since deconstructionists has kind of fallen out of favor. So that just gives you a little taste of the different ways that professors and scholars have gone about reading literature. There are lots of other schools or ways to do it. My suggestion to you is not to necessarily pick a particular method and read everything through that lens, but instead to read the work first and let the work determine for you what it is that you might want to focus on. And I think that's probably going to be a much more effective way. So rather than saying that you are a Freudian critic, which means that you're more than just a psychological critic, but that means you're reading everything through the lens of Sigmund Freud and his psychological theories, Instead, just let the text let you decide whether it's appropriate to read this text from a Freudian perspective, or perhaps it's better to read the text through a historical perspective instead. Now, the next section, reading fiction, talks about how important it is to read carefully and deliberately. And that means rereading. Oftentimes, students will tell me, what am I doing wrong? And that I have to read the reading several times to understand it. And I say, you're not doing anything wrong. You're doing everything right, especially when it comes with a piece of literature. It's probably going to require multiple rereadings. I recommend 3. The first, just to get plot. The second, for analysis. And then the third, to refresh your memory before you begin to talk about it. I'm also a realist. I know that it may not be possible to read something 3 times. In fact, sometimes you struggle to read it just once. But do know that each time you reread something, the more meaning you're going to be able to get from it. And one of the things you can do is write about what it is that you're reading. That's also very useful, whether you annotate or you write notes in the text, or you journal. And in other words, you write notes on a computer or a separate sheet of paper about your thoughts or observations. And in fact, that's one of the things that I'm going to be having us do in class. If you'll remember, I had indicated that there's going to be a journal due at the ending of each unit, where I'm going to ask you to, in our first unit, select 3 of the short stories out of the handful or so of short stories we're going to be reading, and to write about a page or so, to journal for about a page or so with your thoughts and reflections about that particular short story. And that you can think of it as your note taking. And I don't evaluate it for grammar or mechanics. I just read it for content. And I grade it on a checkmark scale, so it's meant to be informal. And that's a way for you to engage with the text, and also a way for you to help you remember the text when you refer back to your previous notes. The textbook is also very useful in this respect, because the textbook will be providing questions at the ending of most of the things that we're going to be reading. And some of those questions are questions that actually I'm going to be posing with us as a class. But you can use those questions to guide your own reading, in that you can read the questions first before you begin to read the short story, and know that those questions are going to be somehow important as you address those particular areas in your reading. Or you could read the piece first and then refer to the questions if you don't want any spoilers. So, and then think about how they both fit together. The questions are also something that you could address in a journal that you might want to talk about in greater depth. But there's lots of different ways you could go about a journal. We'll talk about this some more once we actually start reading the short stories, which is basically going to begin next week. And we're going to begin with the story of an hour, which actually was in our first set of readings for today, in the set of readings about careful and deliberate reading. But I wanted to revisit it next week to illustrate how we could just go through and understand the story. But if you see the story of an hour on page 15, you'll see that they give you an example about a reader, much like yourself, who would have gone through the short story, and they would have made perhaps notes, observations that occurred to them, questions that they had as they were reading. And that's what annotating is. But again, we'll revisit this when we talk about story of an hour next class. Page 17 of the textbook, if you have the textbook, gives you that example of the annotation. And also page 20 of the textbook talks a little bit about journaling, if you were thinking about starting the idea of journaling fairly soon. And basically, when it talks about journaling, it talks a little bit about the idea of how someone talked about the story of an hour, and what they did was they wrote several paragraphs. And I would say that this is an example more between a journal and a paper. It's longer, and it looks much more formal than what I would expect with a journal, though certainly you could do that. They wrote 3 pages just on one short story. But you can see that it's not as polished or well written as a paper would need to be, that they would hand in, because they make references not only to themselves and their own thoughts, but to their father, their grandmother, and lots of other things. So I see it as kind of between a journal and a paper, but it can give you an idea of how you could go about analyzing a particular text. And For our next class, what we're going to do is read two short stories. One is entitled The Secret Sorrow. That's on pages 31 through 38. And what it is, it's a section of a novel, a chapter. And I was able to find it online, so I've got the online link there. And we are also reading a short story entitled The Sorrowful Woman, and that's on pages 39 through 43. Again, I was able to find a link, so the link is also included below. And you can see that even though both of these pieces have very similar titles, they're very different from one another. One is considered to be the piece of literature that scholars and critics would say is worthy of study in an academic classroom. It's got depth and sophistication and quality to it. The other is written for entertainment, and it probably is not worth much time or effort from an academic perspective. And I think you'll be able to see pretty clearly when you read the two stories the differences between the two. We'll also talk a little bit about writing about fiction. And these two short stories will talk about how sometimes writing is done in a very predetermined way. In other words, in a formulaic way. And usually formula fiction is the kind of fiction that you read just for pleasure, but probably is not necessarily worth a whole lot of time from an academic perspective. So that's where we're heading next class. In other words, starting next class, we get to read the short stories. And that's where the class begins, as far as I'm concerned. And that's also where you can begin thinking about what to write journals about, which short stories, which three. But of course, you can always reference any of the other materials that we've talked about in class as well. So today's attendance question, and this will be due Friday the 29th at 10 a.m. And if you need an extension, just please let me know and I'll be happy to grant it to you. What do you think makes a piece of literature worthy of study and why? What do you think makes a piece of literature worthy of study and why? So I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are. As I said, there is no right or wrong answer here necessarily. It's not an easy thing to try to define literature, let alone to try to determine what's worthy of academic study. But it's a question we'll be grappling with all semester long, so I'd like you to at least begin thinking about it now and then keep it tucked away in the back of your head. And as I indicated with the discussion forums, once you've responded to the question, you don't need to respond to your classmates, but I encourage you to read what your classmates have written, because ultimately that'll give you a sense of what they would have said in class. And then if it moves you to respond to any of those comments, do so. And I will be responding to all of those comments as well, so you should read my responses as well, so you can get a sense of how the entire class thinks about what makes a piece of literature worthy of study and why. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And next week we will begin with A Secret Sorrow and A Sorrowful Woman. Take care. Bye-bye.